Hello,
Hello.
I'm Alex,
And I'm Val.
and we are here at the end of In at the End. I know, that was lame. Nonetheless, we are about to talk about Made in America, the final episode of The Sopranos.
It's crazy. I have been crying.
It's true, she has.
As soon as Don't Stop Believing comes on the jukebox, I just started weeping.
Every time.
Every time. Every time. Yeah. We even watched that final scene twice.
Well, because we write notes as we watch the show, and as we got to that scene, I think we thought that it was a good idea to just watch it, and then maybe just rewatch it so we could write down some notes on it, and we could enjoy it.
Yeah, but I cried both times.
Cried both times. It is always emotional, but after working on this for over a year and analyzing every episode immediately afterwards, it really is something. It really adds up even more. So, because this is the last episode, if you're just tuning in to hear this, which I imagine will happen. This is a podcast.
In at the end.
Yeah, this is a podcast where we watch every episode of The Sopranos and then immediately we come and have a discussion about it. So
Because we like to talk to each other.
Because we like to talk to each other. And typically in our life, the entertainment that we choose is watching Sopranos and then talking about it. So on this viewing, we had the idea of just recording those conversations and putting it out there. So it's been going on now for over a year, and I can't believe that we're finishing it. But There's so much to talk about in this last episode, and I've personally been really excited to delve into this one, not only for the ending, which is talked about,
I mean, maybe more than any ending of any show ever.
probably, so extensively, but also the episode on the whole, because I think that it ties into the themes of The Sopranos as a series, and it really does wrap up the entire show, and I think it's just so expertly created. I love it so much, and I think it's perfect. I think they really leave it in a perfect place. I'm definitely a fan. I like this show.
We definitely like this show. That's what we've learned. The thing that we also really enjoy is hearing from people who also care about this show as much as we do and who have ideas. So do email us and let us know your ideas or your thoughts, or if, something we said resonates with you or not.
Offends you.
Or deeply offends you. Let us know. I think, we're going to try to, so we typically also do, except we didn't do for season 1, but or two, but we typically also try to do like a season recap at the end of each season.
More of a discussion, more of kind of like
recap is the wrong word.
Deconstruction of the themes and kind of looking at what happens from beginning to end of a season and where.
So some of that might kind of seep into this a little bit, just because it is. I mean, it wraps up this entire. I mean, it wraps up the entire season, obviously, but it also wraps up the series. So
right.
We do want to have a few maybe further discussions, probably a season recap,
right? 60,
and maybe even kind of like an overall process recap. But
we'll see special bonus features to come.
But this has been a long time coming, so I guess we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of places that we could start in this episode. I personally would start with the final scene. I think, first of all, that's probably what people want to hear us talk about, if anything. If you want to hear us talk about anything, it's
our
probably
podcast is called In at the End.
So why don't we just jump in at the end? God, 2 of those immediately. That's rough.
Yeah.
I'm annoying.
Really
Sorry.
rough. Okay.
What I want to talk about with this is that there are some rather kind of definitive theories that are out there about the ending.
Yes, and people who have written on these things
extensively and much clearer than we could in a podcast and do a much better job than we could do as people. So we'll probably be referencing those. In fact, a pretty definitive one, and actually one of the people who reached out to us, which was really cool, is this website Masters of Sopranos, which we're big fans of and we think offers a really comprehensive view of a reading of the final scene. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because there are these theories kind of floating out there, and we're going to talk about our opinions of the ending. And in many ways I do prescribe to the readings of what happens in the end, but in other ways I have some other ideas. But in terms of laying out the details of Tony is dead, Tony isn't dead, who did it, I would rather divert to these other resources that are out there, because I think that they do a better job. And
they can, they
they're
have a lot of like screenshots and things like that, which are screenshots. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Freeze frames of scenes. And of course, like they've, written it out in a cohesive kind of manner.
And that website, Master of Sopranos, is worth checking out because it is very comprehensive. I think it's like a first place that a lot of people go when they do finish the show.
Yep.
Because it does lay out this very convincing theory of what happens to Tony. And I think that it's relevant to probably any interpretation. But for myself, I think the ending kind of is a little bit more symbolic or something than just meaning whether Tony dies or not. And I think that I'd like to get into these themes and ideas, but the question of does Tony die or does Tony live isn't actually the central question of the end of the show.
I think it is a question of the end of the show, but I think what I take away from it is it doesn't matter.
Right. And that is how I feel as well. I think that
it's all a big nothing.
It's all a big nothing. Or not. Or don't stop believing. But I think that there's like a human fixation on wanting to give an answer to is Tony alive, is he dead, to give these absolutes. And one of the central themes of the show is to deal in ambiguity, to recognize this human behavior of wanting to answer questions and not being able to. This idea of black and white viewpoints and constantly throwing us ambiguity. And I think that we're given the ultimate ambiguity at the end of the show where we can never know what happens. There is a case made that Tony dies, and to give like a kind of quick recap of it, because I think it is relevant, there are these bell sounds that occur every time somebody is entering Holston's. And every time a bell sound happens, we're triggered to a point of view shot from Tony. So the camera switches, and what we see is what Tony sees.
Whoever's entering.
And this is made very clear by the positioning in the room. Tony enters the room. There's a kind of jump shot to where he's sitting in the restaurant so we can see where he's looking, that he has a clear view of the entrance. And we see different people entering the restaurant. We actually have many examples of people entering, so we really establish this pattern.
Yes.
We have Tony enter, then we have kind of like a random lady enter.
Kind of like a Janice. She looks a little bit like a Janice.
Curly-haired lady.
Yeah.
We have guy with USA hat.
Yes.
We have Carmela. We have AJ entering with
behind another guy
wearing a members only jacket. At the end, we have this bell sound trigger again as the door opens, as it has every time, but Meadow does not enter.
Well, we also have the black guys who enter too.
Oh, that's right. I missed that. Sorry. But we have this cut to black, this iconic...
Very important.
That actually is pretty important. There's a lot to talk about there. But in the end, we have this cut to black that's triggered immediately after the bell sound rings. And because we've established this repetition of going to Tony's point of view, the theory is that Tony has died. Now, this is backed up by a number of things. There's this flashback that happens at the end of last episode, going back to the first episode of Sopranos 6B, Sopranos Home Movies, where Bobby says to Tony, it's probably like you don't even hear it happening. We have the scene where Syl is in New York, and there's a hit right next to him, and there's slow motion he doesn't recognize until after it's already occurred.
Yeah.
The flashback is a very rarely utilized technique in The Sopranos, and typically it kind of backs up something to be of importance. So our attention is really brought to that statement.
At the very end of last episode.
At the very end of the last episode, which kind of segues into this episode.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that.
We will talk about that also.
Don't get off track.
The theory is that the man in members only jacket who walks in is the one who is ordered to hit Tony.
We have a lot of emphasis on that character, right?
We have a lot of emphasis on that character.
We see him... We definitely see him come in with AJ. We see him glancing kind of shiftily around.
We see him specifically looking at AJ and Tony, and interestingly, we have a shot on AJ with clear focus on him.
Yes.
Man in jacket.
Kind of like peering.
Sorry, man in jacket. Members only jacket. Man in members only jacket is out of focus, which is also showing that they are not aware of him.
Yes.
But we are. So there is this focus on him as a character coming in, looking at Tony, choosing to go to the bathroom. Tony is aware of him as he walks in. He's not as aware of him as he kind of gets behind him to go to the bathroom. So the timing with the bell ringing and Meadow entering is in line with the members only jacket man leaving the bathroom, shooting Tony. Again, also a reference to
Godfather.
to Godfather 1 and this like iconic mob hit. So, continuing. Members only jacket, also referencing to, I believe, season 6A, episode 1. Members only. This little plot point with Eugene Pontecorvo wanting to leave the mob, being unable to. He shows up to the scene at Satrial's wearing a members only jacket. So there is a bit of connective tissue there, referencing members only jacket guy to Eugene Pontecorvo and this kind of like mob connection. Also to the fact that there are so many people that Tony has impacted in his life, that there are all these people who could want to kill Tony. I mean, we're coming out of this New York mob war. Of course, there's people on the New York side who could still be interested in getting rid of Tony.
Yeah, I mean, Phil Leotardo just got hit.
Phil Leotardo just got hit. He just took out a boss. So it's pretty clear why that could be happening.
Actually, Walden took out a boss.
Walden took out a boss. Our favorite character.
Yeah.
We have even that reference to Eugene Pontecorvo. I'm bad at pronouncing his last name. I apologize. Val's glaring at me. She's unimpressed by my pronunciation.
I think it's just Pontecorvo.
Pontecorvo.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll work on it.
I don't know.
There are people who could have reason for Tony to be killed. The other
everybody.
Everybody, basically. We've talked a lot about collateral damage in the last episode, specifically using examples like this guy on a motorcycle who was killed as fallout from a hit on Syl, in addition to the Ukrainian guy and his daughter. There's a lot of examples of other people being impacted and Tony's behavior having a negative impact on other people.
Well, this black hole of the Sopranos that, you get sucked in and you're impacted whether you want to be or not.
Right. In many ways, it seems kind of inevitable that somebody could want to kill him. The other main plot point is this Carlo Gervasi story, which is that his son, Jason, got picked up selling ecstasy, which we've actually come to see Jason quite a bit. Carlos' son and Patsy Parisi's son are the two
Also
Jasons,
Jason.
the guys who poured acid on the guy's toe with AJ. So there is this other story of somebody flipping, this other imminent danger to Tony that he faces. The other aspect of the end with the cut to black is that there's ambiguity towards what happens to Tony, but all possible readings of what would happen after the show are bleak.
Yeah,
I don't really see...
There's no possibility that life just goes on in the way it has been for Tony. Like, whether he dies right now, whether he dies later, whether he gets indicted, right? Like his lawyer,
Right.
Mink, says says that there's an 80 to 90% chance he's going to be indicted. Right. Those are pretty high odds for someone who's really into gambling, like Tony seems to be in this season.
Increasingly.
There's not really, it's not ever going to go well for him.
Right. And it's not ever going to go away. In fact, the pressure seems to be increasing.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of talk of like Tony looking over his shoulder, and having to look over his shoulder is an aspect of the final scene, which we can see him doing. He has to be aware of dangers to himself because of the life that he's lived. In fact, there's even this kind of white-haired guy behind him who we see, this man over his shoulder, that reminds me at least of Phil Leotardo
totally.
or the Ukrainian guy.
Yeah.
This kind of reference to dangers both to himself and to people that he's caused.
Yep.
And how, again, this other reading is that we don't know what happened, but Tony will always be looking over his shoulder is a fair possible reading. I think everything, for me, kind of feeds into the same place, that Tony is left in this very kind of bleak place where his family is actually not complete. We don't have Meadow. We're referencing the end of season 1 where Tony made the statement that it's these little things that count. It's these times with family, which is probably one of the more optimistic readings that we can take from the philosophy of The Sopranos. And we can kind of prescribe some value to it. But at the same time, Tony doesn't even remember that statement when AJ references it. And we're kind of left with this feeling of tension. Meadow parking her car in a way that makes us feel very anxious. We never
It's usually
actually
where we
see...
park our car when we go to Holston's also.
It's true.
Yeah.
It is normally where we park. There's normally a parking spot there. It's normally pretty easy to park.
Yeah.
And if those cars were there, it would be pretty easy to park in that parking
To park,
spot.
yeah.
But we're left without that feeling of family connection because Meadow never makes it in. So we have this kind of ultimate tension that we're left with because it never is united.
I don't know, like... I think part of the thing that makes me cry every time I watch this final scene like a baby is that there are these small glimmers of this family that's like, you know, despite their circumstances and despite their huge flaws, are just trying to have a little moment of joy, right? Like eat the best onion rings in the state.
Which they are. Actually,
well, I have not eaten a lot of
I don't know.
New Jersey
Actually,
onion
to
rings.
be fair, those are the only ones I think.
Yeah, but
I
they
like
are
them.
delicious.
Yeah.
Their
ice cream is possible.
Their ice cream is terrific. I highly recommend.
And
Their
milkshakes.
burger, what do they call it?
House special.
The
2
house
burgers.
special.
Highly recommended.
Highly recommend.
We're not sponsored by Holston's, by the way. I wish we were. I wish to God so strongly that Holston's would sponsor us and give us those house specials for free because it's my favorite thing in the world.
If you go to our, I don't know how you guys listen to this podcast, but if you go to our show notes of this podcast, you can see a picture of us at Holston's.
I think it was in an early episode.
Okay, well, we'll put it in this one again for you.
Got it.
Yes. So, anyways, so this family's trying to, like, you know, they're busy. They're kind of all like, even though they still are all in this orbit together, they've just come out of this like pretty scary time for them, right? They've been separated, and yeah, it's like it's very traumatic, you know. So they come together, like, you know, the way that Tony and Carmela look at each other, like, for me, like, I can't help to still, like, you know that they care about like, even though they're both really fucked up, that they care about each other on some level, right? And they are this unit, whether it's good or bad. Like, they have a relationship with each other we've witnessed throughout this whole show. You know, when we see Tony like grab AJ's hand when AJ sits down, right? Like, it is this kind of like tender moment, right? They were just, you know, during this episode, we have a whole arc of AJ potentially leaving to go to the army, right? And then now they've kind of like sucked him back in, which again is
something we'll talk about.
But like the way that Tony grabs his hand, like he's proud of him, right? And he's, you know, even when AJ's complaining about getting coffee and taking calls or whatever, you know, he's like, it's an entry level job, like, you know, see where it takes you kind of thing. It's tender. It's, you know, it is this kind of, it's this small moment of joy.
And yet, I feel like it's complicated.
Sure.
Because the only moment that we saw of joy, of real joy for me in this episode for AJ, is when he's talking about the car exploding. And he talks about how there was something cleansing about seeing it explode. And for me, that actually sums up a lot, because the car is a gift from his parents. He was given it. It does represent this materialism that he's seemingly against, and this kind of easy way of life that he inherits through the pain of others.
Yeah.
That's profiting off the pain of others. And when it explodes, there is this kind of movement towards a new life, possibly, for AJ.
It's like the opposite of these baptismal cleansings that we've seen in the past. Fire cleansing instead of water.
Right, absolutely. And the explosion is maybe appropriate because that's what it needs. There's also this relationship that he has with Rhiannon that I find
we're jumping right to some other stuff here. Keep going.
That's okay, because for me I want to talk about the ending of the show right now.
Okay.
And part of that is where these characters end up. And I think that the ending does pull together these threads and does leave us in this place of finality.
At it. Keep going.
You're okay with
Rhiannon, yes.
So, yeah, this idea of AJ saying, ever since it blew up, I feel cleansed or something. That he's and he has this feeling of happiness that he sees his seat blowing up. I think that we've referenced the SUV at multiple times in the show. We see Meadow getting this SUV in this complicated manner ages ago in The Sopranos. We have it kind of as a representation of this easy life that AJ has inherited. And we have Tony having these complicated feelings about coddling AJ from his mother, but the reality is that both of them are just giving him things and haven't allowed him to be his own person, work for himself, really work hard. There are these moments where, for instance, Tony gets him into this construction job where we see AJ actually doing better. Mm-hmm. And the moments where we actually see AJ on a better course are where he falls out of this soprano orbit, which is something that we talked extensively about in Blue Comet, the last episode, if you're interested in orbits and our very poor understanding of solar systems and astronomy.
Comets, yes.
But for me, that's a very interesting moment because it does represent this time where AJ has found a relationship that he's engaging in that's different than the relationship that the relationships that his family has. We see him actually being friends with Rhiannon, which goes against how his dad would act around women. Mm-hmm. He hasn't actually inherited his dad's proclivities and his kind of womanizing and his fundamental lack of respect for women that we see throughout the show. And they actually are friends, and AJ is worried about how it could be a bad idea. And ultimately, they do kind of share this tender moment and this connection that they have. For me, what seems like a real connection. And the car blows up, and we're left with AJ not having inherited these material objects that he does have issues with, and he can point out the issues with. But in the end, he's pulled back into the orbit.
Well, sure. Like I was going to say, like the BMW, his parents got him.
Of course.
He just said it's not a SUV.
Well, I mean, and that goes to this example, too, of what I see a lot in this episode is referencing that statement that Melfi saw in the academic study talking about using, I forget the exact words, but like rationalization or using interpretations as a criminal to rationalize, or what is it?
Yeah, I didn't write that one down.
You know exactly what I'm talking about. But this idea, using insight as a rationale for criminal operations. Yeah. It's a paraphrase, but it's something like that.
For heinous activities or something.
Yeah, exactly. Using your insight to justify your unacceptable behavior.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we see Meadow doing, and we'll get to that when we talk about Meadow. But we definitely see AJ doing that as he's gifted these things again, and his life is made easy. He ends up the episode as this development executive, quote unquote.
Yeah.
He's given another car. There's these examples of him being pulled back. Like when Tony picks up AJ, we see him running. Again, like an example of physical activity.
Yeah, like doing something healthy and...
Yeah, doing something himself.
Yeah.
Right? Moving towards something himself. And Tony comes, kind of jokes about the Rocky theme and gets him back in the car. And there's this kind of sad ending where we're left with AJ being pulled back into the orbit. And I have very little faith that he will become his own person and break through the curse of the Sopranos.
No, but likewise, we see Meadow, like, whereas in end of season 3, right, we see Meadow running the opposite direction across a very similar looking street.
Absolutely.
We see her in this episode running frantically, like almost desperately, right? Towards her family, right? Towards this... whatever, black hole, which is how I like, and there's that, really key scene when she goes out to dinner with Tony to have sake bombs or whatever they're doing. Where, she comes out more fully with her rationalization for why she's chosen criminal law. And it like puts it out there for us entirely, right? Like if I hadn't seen the FBI pick you up all those times, where was I? Yeah. If I hadn't seen you dragged away by the FBI so many times, I would have been a boring suburban doctor. This, like, and you see Tony's face kind of in response to that, right? Again, we talked about this last episode. I don't think that was Tony and Carmela's hope for their children, but what they've given them is there's no escape from this orbit.
No.
They haven't set them up to be able to go off and live these independent lives.
Right. And also her statements like the state can crush the individual.
Yeah.
Like, again, another rationalization for me that is pushing her into
because she's
law.
Smart and and we've seen her rationalize lots of things with, journal articles she read or I forget what she was reading about like the family unit or whatever at one time when she was first at Columbia, right? And she like comes out with these, very smart sounding statements, but they are all these kind of rationalizations for feeling like what she's doing is right. And we see all the characters in this show doing that at different points.
Right. I do want to talk about more that what you brought up, Meadow running away from the family at the end of season 3 and running towards Holston's at the end of the series. For me, that was like the big kind of like light bulb moment of this viewing of The Sopranos, because I think it's so pivotal, and I think that the same thing applies to Meadow and AJ. I think that there's this central question of who will these people be? Who are they?
Yeah.
Who can they become? And ultimately, we're left with an interpretation of Meadow and AJ coming back. So going back to the end of season 3, we have to remember the scene of
Jackie Jr.'s funeral.
Corrado singing, and Meadow getting increasingly drunk and choosing to
throw bread,
point out the hypocrisy of the people around her, and leave. And she runs away and actually crosses the street. Now, the last scene that we're left with in The Sopranos is Meadow running frantically across the street towards her family. So there's this moment at the end of season 3 where she is departing the family. She is actively choosing to leave. She's actively choosing to get further away. And in the scenes and episodes that follow that moment, we actually do see Meadow remove herself from the soprano orbit.
Yep.
And ultimately, I think my interpretation is that she's doing much better for it. And that in many ways, this is the only answer to the toxicity of the Sopranos.
Yeah.
And this New Jersey crime family.
Yeah.
The only thing you can do is leave and extricate yourself.
Yeah.
And in the end, this magnetic pull brings them back. Because we have AJ driving a BMW, rationalizing. We have Meadow as a criminal lawyer who's been impacted by her experience as a child, who's been impacted by seeing her dad get pulled away. And we see him actually responding to that. I think he's unhappy that he will not have Dr. Soprano, this thing that has a nice ring to it that he's talking about in Blue Comet.
Sounds nice.
But there was this inevitability to them being pulled back and not being able to break that curse. And I think it's really interesting because this show is constantly looking at this cycle of generations. What do parents pass on to their children? What do they inherit? And are they able to break this chain of behavior? And ultimately, they never do. Especially in this family.
Yeah.
So in the end, what we're left with is basically Meadow and AJ displaying the same behavior as Tony. Acting in different ways, having a different life, but ultimately the same fundamental problems still
follow
exist.
Them. Yeah.
And both of them are unable to withdraw from this self-fulfilling kind of lifestyle that damages others but benefits oneself.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because the second last scene we get of this episode is Tony finally going to see Junior.
Right.
And so for me, it really does hammer home this family unit, again, like this family unit, this soprano curse, right? But in the end, Junior is left with nothing. He doesn't even remember that he and Johnny Boy were the bosses of New Jersey.
Right.
Right. Like he doesn't remember where his money is. He doesn't remember his family members. He doesn't remember that he had this success, quote unquote, in his life. He just has nothing. And I think that's the thing for these characters that's what that leaves me with is like, again, thinking about, okay, so there's a cut to black and like, now what? I think they're all left with nothing. I don't know that any of them have a deeper meaning to their life, right? Like Meadow, for some reasons being offered $170K for not even having, is she even in law school? Like it's really unclear, but because of a man who's kind of getting her that job and saying like, don't devalue her. Yeah. Don't devalue yourself and like telling her these things. And
that guy seems like the worst.
Well, his family's kind of the worst.
Right. Well, everybody's kind of the worst.
Everybody is the worst, But yeah, like, so, okay, so like Meadow's life, where, in the end of that, like, what does she have? AJ's life at the end of it, what is he gonna have? And, you know, hopefully these characters do still have potential to, you know, maybe, like, again, like, maybe once Tony dies, I don't know, right? Like, maybe there is still capacity there for them to do good and make meaning, but also it could just all be a big nothing, and in the end you die in your own arms, right? And we have Junior, you know, left. I mean, that scene, I think that's what kind of gets me off on the crying thing. It kind of sets me up for it, because that scene is kind of it for me in some ways too. I think that's like one of the big moments in this show, because we I don't know, and it kind of goes back to what you were talking about with material goods and things like that also, like the things that we hang on to and the things that have meaning in our lives, including this like image of this family and everything that like these characters have worked so hard to create over the course of their lives and of this show is meaningless, right? We have that line from Livia, like, in the end your friends and family let you down and you die in your own arms, right?
Nice.
Tony and Carmela are letting AJ and Meadow down. AJ and Meadow are letting Tony and Carmela down. You know, like, there's like nobody's in it for these other people. But like I said, this family that kind of comes together, like, we do. I don't know. I don't even know. I can't even really put words to it, but despite all of this, they are this unit, right? And they do have these relationships, and yeah, I just like hope that they can make meaning out of it. I'm left, I don't know.
Well, here's
I'm always left trying to still remain an optimist and not think it's a big nothing. And so I think like the juxtaposition of, you know, Tony leaving Junior and then us coming to like have this kind of family moment, that is important.
Right.
It's at least a little bit hopeful.
Well,
that there's some good. Again, like remembering the good little moments, right?
I think there is.
Yeah.
And I think that's this like
fascinating... I'm going to like cry again doing this podcast.
Oh,
I know. That'll be a mess.
There is this like fascinating paradox that happens at the end. And for all of the focus on black and white viewpoints throughout the show, there is this irony that there is this kind of like ultimate duality of good and evil that does actually kind of end up at the end of the series of these like negative and positive viewings of ultimately you can only see things in these two ways
through these paradigms.
And there is this ultimate nihilism that's embodied by Livia. But for me, there's also this don't stop believing. Mm-hmm. And there's like, David Chase has in interviews said actually that the ending was supposed to be much more on point than many people analyzed it to be. And that for him, it was about don't stop believing, that there's all these terrible things. And it sounds insane when you hear that.
I know. You're like, really?
It's kind of like,
are you pranking us, David Chase?
It's kind of like when I started listening to Paul Thomas Anderson interviews, and he was asked what There Will Be Blood is, what its central message is, and what it's about, and he said, oil. Which I loved. That was a great interview.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it just reminded me of that. Also, all of his movies were about family.
Yeah.
Which is true, but awesome answer.
Yeah, great answer.
I think there is something to that, though, and that we are left, actually, believe it or not, on a somewhat optimistic note.
Yeah.
And that as we're scrolling through the songs, many are actually much bleaker.
Right.
But Tony does choose Don't Stop Believing. The other ones we have were, you know, A Lonely Place. Even Those Were the Days.
Yeah.
Kind of tying into these main themes of the entire Sopranos, reminiscing for times past. Even like going back to the very beginning of the episode when Tony's with Polly, they're listening to this 1963 song, Denise, in the car. There is this constant yearning for the old times. I think in Blue Comet we were talking about actually like specific examples. They're all over the place. It's not hard to find. This cold open in the second episode.
Yeah.
There is this kind of coming at the end of something good, yearning for the before times, which is interesting right now, this idea of like making America great, because it is kind of that. It is thinking back to a time where maybe these people did better and yearning for it, feeling that they've been lost. But ultimately, like, there is this kind of this constant focus on that of kind of looking back. And there is kind of something sad about it where these people feel like things are not the same and things have gotten worse. There's this all started from a song name. Those were the days.
Yeah.
But I've Got to Be Me. I can get into these endlessly. I'm Alive, perhaps foreshadowing for what happens to Tony. Tony has to be himself. I won't even, that's too obvious. I'll let other people depack these things. But there is this choice. Yeah. There is this agency.
Yeah, why does he choose Don't Stop Believing?
Well, that's what we're left with. And the other thing, too, is that despite the horrible nature of the Soprano family and its representation of humanity and the human condition that we can extract from the Sopranos, it is one mafia family. And there are good people out there. And maybe, even though we don't witness them, there are these important
agents or,
and there are these things of importance and these aspects of good. And just because these characters don't exhibit them, they do exist, and perhaps it's a lesson in what is really important. Because like you said, Junior is left with absolutely nothing. He doesn't remember who Tony is. I feel like we kind of go into that scene thinking that maybe it's kind of reflection of Livia acting as a manipulation of
which we had also seen Junior do back.
Right, of kind of using your mental state as a way of manipulating other people, but ultimately it's not that. Yeah. He can't even do that anymore.
Yeah.
And he does just forget everything. And it's fascinating because for all the conversation about money should go to Bobby Bacala's kids, Janice might not do that. Tony recognizing that Janice is probably manipulating her own situation to take these kids to get Junior's money. That won't even happen because Junior doesn't know where his money is.
Yeah.
So if you live this life this way, ultimately what can you expect? You can expect death, you can expect imprisonment,
go to jail.
Or you can end up like Junior in a state mental facility.
With nobody who cares about you anymore.
With nobody who cares about you.
Maybe Uncle Pat.
Uncle Pat, I guess, kind of cares about you. And this idea of you two ran North Jersey, that's nice. That's all it is. That's his final scene.
Yeah.
It's nothing.
It's painful.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to make Val cry.
Yeah. Oh.
But as sad as it is for these characters in the end, I think we do have to keep on believing. And I think that even the characters that we're left with, like you said, Meadow, AJ, we can still believe that maybe they can break this curse. Oh God, it's gonna happen.
No, I'm okay.
Okay, what do you want to talk about? Let's divert.
Go ahead. It's good. Yeah, I think let's be honest. Don't Stop Believing is a perfect song. It's a perfect specimen of a song. So I really enjoy it in this moment, and I think, I love hearing it at weddings. I love the song "Don't Stop Believing," but I do think I think that's the lesson, and it's kind of like Tony going back to that symbol of the yin and the yang and this balance that we're kind of given these things to weigh in this show, right? Or and obviously in this episode, but in the show on a whole. And in every, right, so yin and yang, for anyone who doesn't know what a yin yang is, there's a little bit of the black and the white, and there's a little bit of the white and the black.
And balance.
And there's this balance, and they're equal, but within each of them is contained some of the other, right? And so, we can try to see Tony, you mentioned, Tony's wearing all black in this
pretty much the entire episode,
maybe even most of this season he's wearing black, but even in this character that is clearly bad dude,
right,
that there is still this stuff to believe in, and there is still Melfi says he has some insight into insightful things to say, and he
right actually that's a very fascinating reading of yin and yang that I haven't thought of. That was very insightful. It's like Tony's mothers and bus. I like that because that is what we're left with. We do want to assign kind of like totality or
Yeah.
something, like this like all bad or all good
Yep.
to characters, but
Yep.
ultimately they do all possess some of the other.
Yep.
And things are constantly complicated by
These
people,
like dualities. And
by these
like,
dualities and people's behavior that is redemptive amongst all of this other
Yeah.
behavior that is not.
Yeah.
I love the reading that you had too in Blue comment of him draining the pool, that he does not get a moment of ablution.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really fascinating, really interesting, because in the end, Tony has not atoned for his sins.
No.
At all.
No.
And that's what we're left with.
No.
And I think that
Or does he even like recognize them? Like, I think that's the thing. Like, when I
Right.
compare him again to one of my favorite characters,
Vindicasian.
Vindicasian.
The best.
Who like you can see like actually does grapple with these things that he's
Right.
done, like these bad things that he's done. Tony's never, like, in all his time in therapy and stuff like that, like he's never really grappled with
Right.
you know, like being a good person. I think he's just always kind of taken that for, it's more just about like how people around him impact him, and you know, the negative impact that other people have on him, and how he needs to deal with this, right? Like the impact his mother had on him, and the impact, you know, these business dealings, quote unquote, that happen around him and how they make him mad. But he's never actually dealt with like himself as a good or bad person. I don't think it really bothers him.
Right.
So he doesn't deserve that moment, really.
Yeah.
Even though, yes, like he has this little bit of, you know, these redeeming qualities
Yeah.
in him that we love, and clearly his family loves.
Yeah.
You know, like, you know,
But, yeah.
Meadow going out for dinner, like Meadow feeling like driven by, you know, these things that she's interpreted as, you know, injustices to the Italian community, right? And like, and cares about Tony so much that that's where she's like driven to want to make the world better.
Yeah.
In her own way, you know, by helping Italians. Well,
Jeez.
or whatever she's trying to do, you know.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. I don't know, like, you know, so like his end, we question a lot more. It's less, it's harder to question like, does his family love him? Because I think they do.
Right.
His nuclear family. I don't know about Janice, but you know, like his,
Right.
you know,
Janice
his
is
immediate
I
family.
think Janice is equally a narcissist to Tony, so
Yeah,
it's complicated.
yeah. So it's complicated, but you know, we definitely are brought to question like, does Tony's mob family love him?
Great question.
And I think like in this episode we see, I mean, throughout the show we've seen, you know, those moments where Tony looks around and sees everyone laughing at him, right? Or like is suspicious of people who are around him and their actions. Well, we have those, like, you know, people surrounding him actually becoming very dangerous, right? So with the arrest of Carlos Jason,
Right.
Jason Gervais, and potentially Jason Parisi also.
Well, that would be a reading for
Yeah.
sure. That is like a theory that is out there. And the idea is, I mean, we always see the two Jasons together, just to like quickly sum it up.
Yeah.
We see this very small scene where the Parisis are all over and Tony's,
celebrating Meadow and Patrick's beautiful relationship.
yeah, and they're asked, why isn't Jason here? And then the mom there's this kind of tense moment.
Yeah.
The mom is awkward and says, oh, I didn't think he was invited. So the theory is that the Jasons always together, always engaged in the same behavior, both selling ecstasy, is that the other Jason was also picked up, and Patsy Parisi and his family are also implicated through the same thing that is implicating the Gervaises,
Yeah.
and causing Carlo to flip. And I think that the way that Tony asked that prying question is interesting, because it reminds me of Tony knowing that Polly was the one who spilled the Ralph Cifaretto joke.
Yes.
And he kind of pries him with these aggressive leading questions.
Yes.
We're not given a lot, but the way that he asked that question implies to me that perhaps Tony actually knows, or is at a minimum very skeptical
Yes.
of maybe where Patrick Parisi is at this moment.
Jason Parisi.
Well, no, of Patrick. I think he's
Patrick.
Patsy.
Patsy,
Sorry,
yeah.
Patsy. I'm sure his full name is Patrick. Patson? What?
Patson.
Patson.
Yeah.
I think for me, I do detect a note of concern, because
Yes.
Patsy could be covering for his son Jason. Jason
Yes.
is the one in trouble, or
Yes.
could be in trouble, or he's fine. Ambiguity. We don't know.
Yes.
It's a
I've
reasonable,
always found
educated
Patsy to be
guess.
pretty shady, though.
Well, we also saw him thinking about killing Tony early
Yes.
in the show,
Yes.
pissing in his pool.
Yes.
So there is some kind of past history there.
Yes.
But we're really not given a lot. And ultimately, even actually the way that his wife looks at the china, there's this kind of like, could be read as envy or something about the success and the financial rewards that Tony has. Obviously, in this moment of political vacuum, people could
Power
be
vacuum, yeah.
yeah, power vacuum. People could be, I guess there's politics involved. Anyway, you're right, power vacuum. There could be somebody looking to step up and fill the void too if Tony is killed. So there is kind of
Yeah.
things that could be happening
Yep.
behind the scenes and that we could be reading into. Again, fascinating details. And I think that the end of the show is not about details. I don't think it's about if Tony dies or who succeeds after. I think that the show has given us so much information throughout the course of the series on what they really care about, and there's so much underneath the surface that we need to interpret the ending in the same way beneath
Yeah.
the surface.
Yeah. I think that like that's something that's also really highlighted in this episode. Again, it kind of links into the don't stop believing. It is also the beliefs of these characters that are really highlighted. Again, it's not really details. So like we have multiple instances with the cat, right? And Polly.
Cat.
And the things that Polly believes.
Here we are. This is one of my
and
main
the things
categories.
that it's a category of cat.
Yeah, my
Cat
categories
category?
are Death, AJ, Junior, Cat.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to well, I don't know. We'll see where we go with this, but I think it does come down to and we've seen Tony throughout this show have this kind of intuition about people,
Right.
based on his dreams, right? This episode opens again, like I've been paying attention to, Tony waking up. He actually looks like he's dead,
Absolutely.
but Tony waking
Organ
up,
funeral music coming on.
and he looks like he's kind of in a funeral.
Also, something
Box.
I love about that
Coffin.
scene too is that
Yeah.
after we leave, we see that there are sheets on the bed, and the last scene of Blue Comet, there were no sheets on the
Right.
bed.
So
we know
different.
that time has passed
Yes.
at that point, and that they've been hitting the mattresses
Yes.
in the safe house for quite some time.
Yes,
Very
but-
subtle, but awesome.
Yes, I loved it.
I also
However, yeah, but we talk about these kind of larger, again, like philosophical beliefs on the world, right? We have Polly not wanting to, being this very superstitious person, right? He's, very impacted, of course, by this cat, which we'll talk about. But also, we've seen him, like he brought up in this episode, seeing the Virgin Mary in the Bing, not wanting to take on this position of a lot more responsibility and money, right? Because it's kind of this cursed position where, Richie and Ralphie and
Right.
Vito and Gigi and anyone who's kind of been associated with the Cifaretto crew has been killed.
Right.
And so and he, in the end, he ends up cracking because he doesn't want to see Patsy
Right.
be in charge of anything.
Right. This fundamental kind of human condition of jealousy or something
Yeah.
overrides it.
Yeah. But, we see these two characters like Tony and Polly having a lot of similarities, right? Tony believing in this luck since Christopher died, that his gambling luck is back, right?
Right.
But yet the two characters also can't understand each other, like, even though their kind of outlooks or their superstitions at least are pretty similar.
Right.
They can't recognize these things in each other. It's this kind of like irreconcilable difference in them. So I don't know. So again, this don't stop believing. It's like that is kind of what you have to hold on to in the end. Is best have your own moral code and have your own beliefs and keep going with them, because otherwise there really is nothing. If you don't
Right.
believe in anything,
Great. Love it.
then
Love it. Great.
then you have nothing, right? Then there is
Then
nothing.
there is
Then it is
nothing.
all a big nothing if you don't believe in anything.
So good. Love it. No, it's true, because ultimately these characters do have nothing, and this philosophy of nihilism, this philosophy of a big nothing, stems from the fact that there are no ethics, that there are no
Yeah.
core beliefs.
Yeah, and that's something we've touched on from the very get-go of the show, right? Like the pilot episode
Right.
talks about
Great
coming in
interpretation.
at the end,
Yeah.
and that there's people don't have the same values anymore.
Yeah. And I just like, it's these ideas that I think are so fascinating that they're kind of embedded in the series finale. And that's what, if anything, like our conversation about this, like at least in terms of the readings that I found, so much is just kind of focused on answering the question of what happens in the end of the show, and
which is fun,
which is fun,
so
and,
fun
and
yeah.
amazing, and I think so masterfully done, and so perfect, and such a mystery, and so like just so kind of like expertly crafted in terms of like relating to the narrative of the whole show. But I also think that it's just so fascinating that the show is also the whole time dealing with questions of wanting to look at things in these kind of surface ways, and actually constantly going further and actually embedding the real, for me, I think like the real message and real meaning of the show underneath. And that you can also interpret the end of the show in the same way, and that there are these kind of meanings that are so central to what the intent of David Chase and the creators was.
Yeah.
I think that there's just so many layers. And I think that to only focus on whether or not Tony dies is one layer.
Well, it's like saying The Sopranos is a show about the mafia.
Right. And I have so much respect for everything I've read that does analyze it. I think there's so many things that are done so well. I'm not trying to be critical.
No.
I do think that I haven't seen as much about the thematic elements or something like, and I think that that's just so central to the purpose of this show and the ending. And I think that the Holston scene for me is just such a masterpiece, not only because of the way that they present this mystery and this perfect kind of puzzle to solve and this perfect ending to the story, but the way that it's embedded with a perfect ending to the themes and a perfect ending to the character arcs and a perfect kind of ending to the reflection on America and where it is and how it's evolved as a country and as a culture.
Yep. No, absolutely.
The thing actually that I loved is that the first time we went to Holston's, it felt like it was even a level deeper than I realized. And the show just felt so transcendent to me because not only were these extra levels kind of embedded in the show, but I felt like they were embedded in the place that they chose. So when we went there, it was this kind of community hub where you actually wouldn't feel strange to see the types of people that you see in the final scene.
No.
You would see like a Cub Scout group.
Yeah, and a couple like canoodling
and a guy
eating.
And a guy with a USA hat.
Yeah. It still is just like that.
It's just like that.
Yeah.
It's this like central...
Except they have a jukebox on the one table where
right.
They don't have the one all
And they also have a lot of stuffed animals now.
They
and
do.
pictures of Sopranos characters.
Yeah, but even that's kind of like under... Like, it really just is this like... This place that's very reminiscent of past days.
And holds on to
it's like a soda shop. Like, it has a counter where you can sit and get a milkshake.
And it holds on to these central values of America at that time that I kind of feel were kind of pivotal during those decades.
Yeah.
Like, of family, community, this kind of like wholesome American food, bringing you know, your kind of...
Wholesome house special.
Wholesome health special.
Yeah.
Swiss cheese. You have to get the Swiss cheese. It's so good.
Yeah.
That's probably just because we're not American and don't order
Probably.
the American cheese, but the Swiss cheese is so good. They broil it on both sides of the bun. We're doing a great job advertising Holston's in this episode. You should go. It's great.
We'll have to go to celebrate.
You can invite us. Please email us. And
if
you want to buy us house specials, we'll talk about Sopranos any day of the week.
Yeah, we'll rent a car and drive out there.
It's worth it.
Yeah.
But there is something to this like fundamental Americanness of that place that was so transcendent because that place really is that. They chose a place that actually does kind of embody those values as an actual institution. It seems like it's been in Bloomfield forever. Everybody knows about it. Everybody actually goes. It's not like a It doesn't feel like a Sopranos tourist destination.
It's not. We're the only weirdos in there usually who give a fuck. Like
every once in a while, I see somebody who like wants to sit at that table, but
yeah.
I'd like to point out how hard it is for us to get there. We don't have a car. We don't go to New Jersey, but we've found many times to go to Holston somehow. If there's like anything, like we're like driving on like the I-87, we're like, well, we're in the area. We should probably go.
Yeah.
Holston's and get some onion rings.
Yeah.
They are the best in the state. Even though it's not the state that we're in right now, it's pretty close. We should probably go. Okay, how about... Okay, cat. We're on the cat topic.
Yeah. So cats are just snakes with fur.
Cat showed up during the big storm. That's when we start to see this cat.
Yes.
So, this gets me back into the topic of quantum Sopranos that was discussed.
And Schrodinger's cat.
Schrodinger's cat earlier on in the show. So, we do have, I think, Schrodinger's cat is explicitly referenced in the hospital that Tony is in.
Here's some trivia. What's that guy's name?
Oh, God.
I know.
Trivia's not our
Not
specialty.
my strength. Not my strength.
Neither of our strength, but that's okay. You can remind us. But this idea of... Actually, how about I have you explain Schrodinger's cat? Because science is not my forte. I'm going to sound stupid. And somebody's going to be listening who's like a quantum physicist, and I'm going to sound like an idiot. I don't want to.
I mean, it's not that...
It's not that hard. I know. That's still a reflection on my...
I mean, so the theorem of Schrodinger's cat is there's a cat in the box, and if you open the box, the cat will die. But how do you know if the cat's already dead or not? Because the only way that you can find out is by opening the box.
Okay. So, two possible outcomes, right? We also have this talk about...
Yeah, the cat is alive and in the box. The cat is dead and in the box.
Right.
Or you've killed the cat by opening the box.
Right. We also have this moment where Polly's talking about the cat looking at the picture of Chris, which is interesting actually for me because it both growls at the picture and then meows kind of plaintively to the picture. Mm-hmm. There's these kind of like two opposing reactions. And they also talk about the cat only sitting at the exact corner of the table or where two walls intersect. Oh, that was another cat, but they're still talking about cats.
Yeah.
We're on the cat
That was like
topic
Walden's mom's cat or something. I don't know. Like,
upon entering the final episode that we'd be talking so much about Walden.
Well, I talked about him a few episodes ago, being like, "Who is that guy?" Like when Tony it's Walden.
Where's Walden? But I think what the cat does reflect is this ambiguity and this kind of like this fact that we can't know answers, that there may be that multiple answers exist. Mm-hmm. And I think this also gets towards why I love kind of readings of the ending that prescribe an answer.
Yeah.
But I also feel that it misses the central tenet of the show and the central kind of part of the ending, which is ambiguity. And that ambiguity is kind of the answer.
Yeah.
It's that we don't know, we're not supposed to know, and multiple answers exist.
But maybe what you believe in is the answer.
Maybe.
Right?
Maybe.
And
but I think they still all exist. Even if you believe that the cat's dead, maybe the cat still is alive.
Of course. Of course.
Quantum Sopranos.
Unless you open the box, then you know for sure it's dead.
Right. Is that part of it? I never knew that.
Yeah.
If you open the box, you know for sure it's dead.
Well, no. If you open the box, the cat dies.
That's horrible.
Yeah. We don't...
Can you feed the cat in the box?
No.
So the cat's definitely going to die. It sucks.
See? That's what you believe.
Schrodinger's a dick. Cruelty against animals.
I don't think he actually did it. I think it's like a philosophy.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Got it.
But maybe, so maybe it's this, that there is no answer and there's all these possibilities and none of them are true. Or it comes down to what's actually important is what you believe. Right. And so whether it's like Polly that you think that it's, communicating with Chris's ghost or whatever, or, whether you think it's just a cat and there's just a dead rat behind the wall, or whether, you think, which, people have thought that cat is somehow related to Adriana, who we've seen, right, kind of related to animals and things like that over time. It's it doesn't really matter. It's just this cat who's staring at a wall. Right. But what does matter is how you interpret it and what you take from it, right? What do you take from that? What do you get from the ending of Sopranos? What what does it leave you with? Definitely. And so I think again, both of these things are also true. And I think that it matters and it doesn't. Absolutely, yeah. I think it's interesting too, this idea for me of cats at the corners of tables or where two walls intersect, a point of convergence of kind of multiple lines that
they would exist at the point where they do intersect.
Yeah.
Because I think the ending
and those
of the
and
show,
corners are ambiguous. Does it belong to one side or the
Right.
other side of the wall?
Right. And they can both extend from that point. So if
Yeah.
we look at the ending as a kind of point, then there are these possibilities that extend
Yeah.
from there, these narratives that we can spin from there that are credible.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many theories like Tony is killed, Tony survives and he will be indicted and go to jail. Tony survives and beats the rap again and has beat New York. The audience got whacked. Like it's endless. That one sucks, but it's still out there. I'm not saying it's a good theory. It's a theory. I've read about it. I know it's not a good one, but that's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. If you thought that the audience got whacked, Val is judging you. Sorry.
I mean, that's cool.
Convince us. Write us and convince us.
Yeah,
We're
I'm
very
open.
open. We're very open. We would like to hear your analysis.
No, absolutely that is one thing like that I believe. And again, it kind of goes back to what I was just saying. Like, all that matters really is that you believe in something.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It either has meaning or it has no meaning, right?
Got
Those
it.
are the two. That's what Phil said
You're on
last
fire.
episode.
Yeah.
But it
Great
is
references.
that is what it is, right? Like, it's like what are our options in the world, right? Like, is it feasible to go through life believing that it's all a big nothing? How do you go through life feeling that? What matters is believing in something.
Right.
And these characters all do. And whether it's like a good thing to believe in or not, I think it's better. It's better than nihilism. Not to say that nihilism isn't the reality, right? Like, not to say
Right.
that there is something or that that's like an invalid belief.
Right.
But like, I think like, again, but it is a belief. Like, nihilism is a belief. You believe that there is nothing.
Right. You think I'm a nihilist.
You're a bit
Right.
nihilistic. I mean,
think it's a constructive
Alex
nihilist.
did have a teen punk band called the Nihilists,
Right.
in fact.
I did. That's not why I'm a constructive nihilist.
No, and like, I can be swayed to nihilism also, but
Right.
we differ in the way that like I have to think that there is something like
Right.
that, and that's my belief is that it feels like there's nothing, but I have to believe that there's something.
Fair.
So
Don't stop believing, Val.
I will. Yeah, thank you. I won't. I won't.
I'll work on it.
But yeah, the cat.
Cat also leading to this mural of the tiger
Yeah.
in the back of Holston's. So also having gone to Holston's.
Go Bengals.
Go Bengals. 1973 state champions. Probably when Tony was playing football, my guess.
Roughly, yeah.
Roughly. Very relevant.
Yeah.
That mural was constructed for the final scene. That is not actually at
No.
Holston's. Holston's is not celebrating those two football players in the 1973 Bengals.
Yeah.
But again, there is this like larger cat image too.
Yeah.
And there is this duality of the life that
Tony
Tony
could have
chose and
had.
the life that Tony could have had. Again, going back to Test Stream, the moment where he goes to the bottom of his subconscious into the kind of basement of the school and confronts his high school football coach, I think is one of the key moments to understanding Tony Soprano and to understanding the series. It's a moment where we're given the closest and most thorough kind of level of insight into his psychology. And it's clearly very pivotal to him as a person. And I think that we witness this kind of alternate reality that he could have led. He talks about alternate realities even
Yeah.
to
Well,
Melfi.
Sure. We have him being Kevin Finnerty.
Kevin Finnerty, right. Yeah, exactly. We have him also getting it at the end of Kennedy and Heidi looking up at the sun, which is interesting because right before these final moments where he goes to visit Junior, we have Carmela come out and say that the consensus is Holston. Tony is looking up at the trees, and we have this shot that's kind of reminiscent of Rashomon, of looking straight at the sun. Tony, again, I think like it's his perspective, but we see
There's the wind and the trees.
the wind and the trees, these very strong symbols of the afterlife, of death, of these eternal existential questions that Tony is kind of facing at that moment. But the fact that he's looking straight at the sun, which he saw the solar flare, which triggered him getting it.
Yeah.
And then him talking to Melfi about understanding that there's more out there, that there are these kind of alternate realities. We are confronted with, again, this kind of quantum idea.
Quantum Sopranos.
Quantum Sopranos.
Yeah.
This kind of Schrodinger's cat of it is and it isn't,
Yeah.
and also this possibility of this alternate life, this alternate kind of universe that could have existed had Tony acted differently. Ultimately, the orbit was too strong and he didn't break out of it. Ultimately, probably nobody breaks out of the orbit.
No.
But the potential is there, and maybe that's the idea. That we're confronted with all these horrible actions, this lack of belief, this fundamental nihilism, but one could break it. They are human decisions, and it is the characters who choose to continue engaging in the behavior that
Or
leads
these
them
kind of
to
like
this
easy,
big nothing.
these easy, like I think these easy pathways lead us to the big nothing. Like making easy choices is something that we've grappled with these characters
Right.
over and over again, right? Like AJ being one of them that, you know, we focus on in this episode, but we've had it with other characters too, that is the pull, right? Like living kind of like an easy life, or a life that's familiar anyways, or comfortable. Those are the things that lead us to not break out of cycles, right? Like maybe AJ joining the army, who knows, right?
I strongly believe that's the best thing he could do.
Yeah.
I think that all evidence exists that AJ should join the army, and that it is suggested that that is the antidote to this toxic orbit.
What is the antidote?
Getting away.
Getting away. Yeah. I was gonna say, the army is the antidote.
Again, joining the army is believing in something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's even actually kind of
it's like
suggested
religion,
in the
I mean, right? Like,
about it.
and like all of these kind of institutions that, you know, people lean on when they're searching for something, right? Like, I mean, the army's advertising definitely gets people to believe in.
Well, okay,
something.
so that's really interesting because think about now the episode Army of One.
Yes.
And how that was a short-lived U.S. Army slogan, this idea of you can be an army of one.
And then what does Carmela say in this episode?
Maybe the army would be great for him if there wasn't a war going on. Well, who does fight, right?
Well, sorry, I was going to say...
Oh, you had a different one.
Well, no, I'm talking about Army of One. Carmela says, how can one soldier stop it?
Right, exactly. But there is this idea of an army of one and how the army was actually marketing that.
Sure.
And how one person does have agency to have
Yes.
an impact on the world.
Yes.
We've seen time and time again how Tony Soprano does impact the world around him through his decisions.
Just his one
it
person.
happens to be negatively, but there is potential to do something as an individual, obviously. But that rationalization is another example of using your insight for a criminal operation, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And constantly passing the buck and not taking responsibility and not believing in something.
Is the army a criminal operation?
Maybe. I don't know. Let's not go there. We're already longer than any of our episodes, and we're still like in the like final scene.
Yeah, I know.
We're tying in everything because everything does tie into the
Yes.
final scene. Ultimately, the final scene references not only everything in this episode, but everything in this series.
Yes.
But I do believe that AJ does legitimately look happier after the SUV explodes, and he looks sad at the end of the show when he's talking about how he's just like a helper and he's just getting coffee.
Well, he says earlier, right? It's interesting. Like, we have this progression of AJ even within this whole episode where we have him at Bobby's funeral, and people are talking about Jennifer Hudson, and he says, "You're living in a dream."
Right.
Like, America's supposed to be this place where people still, like, you know, that people still think they can come and make something of themselves, and like, what is it really? And
Bling.
then
You
then
can
we
get
have
bling.
right, like, but he had, like, we're living in the dream, like, you're talking about these stupid TV shows when there's all these
Right.
things going on, and then he ends up working on a Danny Baldwin movie about a detective that is sucked in through his data port. Which is arguably the most hilarious and stupidest idea for a movie. I mean, it sounds real. It sounds like that's definitely a movie that's been made.
That does sound like a real Daniel Baldwin movie.
I mean, I love that they pick, like, we've talked about this in past viewings, but I love that they pick on a lesser Baldwin for this. It's just so great. It's so great for me. But, you know, like, that's what he ends up with, right? Like, he's living in a fucking dream.
Well, he's also, like Meadow says, you're all over the place. I don't know what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So we do have these glimpses into AJ's humanity.
Yeah.
And the fact that he does have these legitimate concerns and some level of insight where he can see things that are wrong in the world. And he wants justice.
Yeah.
But ultimately, he's always pulled back into the orbit. He always does the easy thing. And he never challenges himself to actually do something about it. So ultimately, he does end up contributing to the problem, contributing to a kind of toxic basic culture.
Yeah.
And working on a movie about Daniel Baldwin as a data port sucked in virtual detective.
Yeah, there's virtual prostitutes.
I guess.
That's what they said. But he also, minutes earlier, at least in the prior conversation, to that, talks about being Trump's personal pilot.
He's all over the place.
He's all over the place.
And also, like, this idea of when he's talking about, he goes on this diatribe about President Bush and going to Iraq. It's interesting because we've had all these moments of him kind of flipping through the channels, but ultimately he landed on Iraq and actually sits there. So it does kind of seem to take his focus. It does kind of seem to center him and give him some kind of vision as to what he's interested in. But Jason's response is so kind of jingoistic and basic in an American sense of let's join up, go kill some fucking terrorists. And that aspect still does kind of exist for AJ. Like, he talks about harnessing his hate and just using it against the terrorists. Like, okay, cool read on the Iraq situation, AJ.
Yeah,
great
really
job.
deep. It's interesting. Like, there's this, again, like living in a dream. I mean, dreams are definitely like, both the American dream, quote unquote, as well as actual, like, our psyche and dreams in this show are very important. And I think we even have these kind of strange moments in this episode where, like, for example, we only see Bobby's funeral happening on the surveillance tapes from the FBI. Like, we're not actually at Bobby's funeral. We also have that strange when Carlo comes to talk to Tony, and he says, like, it's not like we haven't envisioned this day. Or no, sorry. Not Carlo. Mink, the lawyer. Mink. Whatever his first name is. It's not like we haven't envisioned this day. And we have this weird surveillance footage of some of the Bing dancers on screen, right? Like, one kind of like running down the hall and one. So we have these kind of surreal or meta kind of moments, right? Like, and again, like, this is a TV show, right?
Right.
Like, we are kind of all living in this, we all live in our own dreams, right?
Right.
Again, like, kind of goes back to like beliefs and things like that for me, that is what we have, right? So whether you're AJ, who is all over the place but has all these beliefs, like, that's his reality, that's his world, right? And again, Schrodinger's box is about that too. Like, what actually is true to you is your reality.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't quite know what to make of it entirely, to be honest with you, but for me there was a connection there. Someone else can do better.
I like it.
Even, even that scene with Butch, right? Like, Butch being on the phone with Phil, right? Phil's in hiding out in Long Island, on Long Island somewhere.
Oyster Bay.
And on Oyster Bay, I don't know.
In Oyster Bay.
In Oyster Bay.
At
and
Oyster Bay?
We have, Butch kind of, like, at first when he's on the phone with Phil talking, walking through Little Italy and in Manhattan, and then ending up in Chinatown, which they are very close together. It's like, it's this one little strip of, like they say in the tour bus that drives by, it's this one little strip of Little Italy where it used to be 40 blocks, but now has been reduced to one row of shops and cafes. Yeah. So it is this kind of like sad, inevitable kind of was it devolution? De-evolution? How do you say that? De-evolution.
De-evolution?
It's not devolution.
But that's how you spell it, isn't it? Nonetheless, this sad progression of Little Italy in New York, where Italian culture has been diminished, or seemingly diminished maybe in the eyes of these characters, by the impact of other cultures kind of coming in and kind of sharing the space. Yeah. And so Butchie also looks confused and concerned as he leaves his kind of comfortable area of Little Italy into Chinatown, and also chooses to turn around and go back to his kind of comfort area. Yeah. But that is a really interesting moment to see how Italian culture has kind of, in that symbolic way, shrunk. Yeah. And maybe their control of New York and their control of their world has shrunk. And in the new time of, the 90s and the 2000s, there isn't really room for the mob in corporate America. And that they do kind of yearn for these, as the song, kind of implies, like, those were the days. Going back to
Right.
You know, these times that are kind of idealized and put up on a
Yeah.
pedestal by all these characters.
Yeah, well, and even Meadow, like in her conversation with Tony, right? Like Meadow talks about like, you know, seeing how it was for the Italians and imagine what it's like for groups arriving today.
Yeah.
I mean, she's not going into immigration law, so I don't know what she really thinks she's going to be
Right.
doing with that. But, you know, whatever. Nonetheless, there is this kind of like aspect of living in these kind of bubbles and not being able, again, kind of like not being able to escape or feeling very uncomfortable when you do escape.
Right.
One thing I didn't talk about when we were talking about the final scene are the two black guys who come in, right?
Right.
So we've seen the Soprano family and other families using African American men as kind of, you know, muscle or, you know, scapegoats in a lot of
mostly
in a lot of
Really?
situations. And we do see one of those guys, right? He comes in and he kind of like grabs his belt. He grabs like where you could potentially carry a gun.
Right. And Tony's
this.
not looking.
Tony's
because
not looking
He
at
actually
them.
chooses to look down when they come in as to like not make eye contact
Mm-hmm.
with them. To like not engage and maybe be aware of what they're doing, which is fascinating because maybe it feeds into his racial prejudice. But also that racial prejudice could be part of the reason why he's not more aware of his surroundings at the moment that he's potentially shot.
Right.
Right? Because he chooses to look down, not engage. That's actually when, if you interpret the cut to black as him being shot by man in members only jacket, he's not looking over his shoulder. Mm-hmm. So actually that racial prejudice could be his own undoing at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot. America. There's a lot about America in here. It's also, you know, these images that we have when they're at, you know, Bobby's funeral after party, if that has a name.
After
Funeral after funeral, where we have Carmela sitting under this image of Mount Vesuvius, right, in Pompeii.
Right, which we also saw Pompeii right next to that very,
The
what
devil
I interpret
thing.
as a very
Yeah.
key scene as the image of a devil in the casino in Las
Yeah.
Vegas, in
Yeah.
Kennedy and Heidi. We also see a Pompeii slot machine. And I think that there is this moment of Vesuvius erupting at the
Yes.
end of the show.
Yes.
There's that.
The
that's
car exploding and the...
Yeah, and I think it's just like, it's a beautiful... Well, even more than that, just generally. Like, I think that there's been this dormant volcano, and it is erupting. I think that at the end of the series, the actions of Tony Soprano are now coming back to impact him.
Yeah.
There is a reaction to the action. It can't go on forever.
Yeah.
And I love that shot. It's just beautiful of being at Vesuvio, seeing Carmela and Tony framing the erupting Vesuvius.
Yep.
It is...
But they're just like eating. They're not, you know.
And
they're-
Tony's looking at Pompeii too.
He
like
is.
it seems like he's aware of this.
Carmela is
eruption.
not.
Yeah, it is. It's a great shot. There's a lot of great shots in
Yeah.
this episode.
I mean,
but-
if you pause this show ever,
beautiful.
like play with it. Like really, I challenge anyone to find a bad shot when you pause this show. They're always just framed so beautifully. We have the scene in this episode as well where we have behind Patsy there's the deer head again at Satrial's, kind of again like
during this cat conversation.
Yeah, talking about animals, talking about like, you know, that was when they were talking about like everyone needs to be looking over their shoulders, right? Like, or in last episode is where we saw that happening. In this episode, we have it during this conversation about the cats and, you know, like these animals that don't see it, you know, they don't see it coming when it happens to them.
It's also interesting, like, we kind of pinpointed Tony's empathy towards animals as maybe being representative of his being a sociopath, and also
Sociopathy.
Yeah, sociopath. That's what I wanted to say, but I got nervous. Thought I'd sound stupid. But there is this like connection that Tony has to this cat that Polly doesn't. Like this disconnect between them as characters and how they respond as people and how their psychology is different.
Yeah.
And also how Tony can do these fundamentally horrible things, but also kind of manifests these parts of empathy and these parts of like a better characteristics towards animals.
Yeah.
is interesting.
We have one thing I wanted to talk about was like where we're left with Carmela. We actually like don't see her a ton in this episode, except for kind of around like being at the
probably
therapist
see
with
Agent Harris about as much as we see
Yeah,
her.
but the one thing we are left with Carmela, right? Like why she's gonna go to Holston's on her own is because she has meetings with carpenters for this investment property where they were hiding out, during the conflict
that might be toxic.
But that might be toxic, right? That has this odor, right? And she's making these plans, right? And Tony even says it, like the
person was 90.
The work was gonna, like, whatever work, the restoration is going to cover up the odor, right? And again, it's kind of like, again, with the asbestos and like that this is just this toxic, you can't cover up this toxicity, right? As much as you can try. It's always there behind the walls. I think that's also like the rat behind the wall. And
that's a beautiful image.
There's always this kind of,
Val on fire.
I'm not on fire. Half the time I make zero sense. And then sometimes I come out with something that you think is good. But there is this kind of like, there's a something going on. Fire truck going back.
Maybe we do live in Flatbush. Maybe there's a mob hit.
Yeah. Or the 21st Street Gang.
21st Street Gang could be that too.
Yeah. But we also have Tony in that scene when they're, at this investment property where they were staying. We have him peeling an orange.
You sure do.
Which is, one of these, Godfather-esque kind of
not only a reference to The Godfather, but also a reference to season 1 where he hits over the stand of oranges in this moment of him almost dying.
Yep.
So something that has been set up very strongly.
Yeah. And again, like it's this, you can never really escape. Like there's always this looming toxicity, poison, whatever it might be.
But also this philosophy that they have, Carmela saying maybe we shouldn't be breathing it.
Yeah.
The fact that she's going to sell this house to someone and also doesn't care that they would be impacting people to that level, to possibly
poisoning them.
And it's like this evolution of her being a little bit concerned about maybe the baby dying in this shoddily constructed house.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of evolved to we don't see Carmela's concern about the toxicity for others. She cares about it for herself.
Yeah.
Which really sums up how this family has lived their whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. The other scene I liked, and again, I'll go on whatever because I know you have a lot. But the other one that I wanted to talk about was just like our last scenes with Agent Harris,
right?
Who I love. Like again, he's a character that I really am drawn to in this show. So we do have him giving information to Tony in the end, right? Like we see him grapple with this, right?
Love it. I actually love the end of his arc, and I think it's more meaningful than I've given it credit.
Yeah.
In previous
so we have him. We start off with this scene. Tony kind of waking up in the house, and they go out in this beverage van, and he's waiting with Polly, listening to this music, right? We don't know who he's waiting for. These car lights flash on him. He gets out. He walks to this other person's car, right? Which we don't see Tony doing that often. Like he's not in the position of power in this moment.
Right.
And he's trying to get this information from Harris. There's snow, the wind is blowing. He doesn't get it. And then Harris kind of cracks, right? Like Harris kind of like needs to tell Tony that something like where Phil is located, right? And then we see him with his coworker later, agent, other guy, that he's like, we're going to win this thing.
Right, which is a little concerning to him.
It's really, I mean, I'm concerned also.
So
we see that like he yells at his wife on the phone when he's in the car with Tony. He's, I think, cheating on him. I don't think his wife is an agent. He's
definitely
not.
Know,
and that agent also doesn't approve of Harris and what Harris is doing and that like giving information to a criminal.
Yeah. So check it out, actually. I think that's a major moment.
Yeah.
And I think there is this yin and yang aspect of the white including the black and the black including the white. And Agent Harris, who we're supposed to see as this good character, does exhibit these poor qualities.
Yeah.
And ultimately, his final evolution is into somebody very conflicted, very complicated, and also somebody who maybe impacts the world in a rather negative way.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm using my hands. I just hit my stand, but that's
This
okay.
is just in our living room.
I'm just
so.
excited about this.
Yeah,
these
no, and I
ideas.
agree. Like, but I think like, you know, he like even though Harris got this new job with the anti-terrorism unit, he still can't escape from Tony's orbit too.
Exactly.
And like, and again, like being a police officer, being in the FBI, like doing a lot of jobs out in the world, like you see some fucked up stuff, right? And other people around you don't understand. Tony does understand death, and like Tony understands these things, and so there is this kind of like putting yourself in the orbit with these criminals, right? Like in some ways they understand you better than the people in your life, like your wife, who just wants you to come home and eat dinner at an appropriate time.
I think there's just like that moment is a moment of transformation, like immediate transformation for Agent Harris as a character.
Yeah.
I think you could read it as a possible reading is that maybe actually this is like the first time that he's cheating on his wife. And there's like this transformation in that he chooses that time to feed the information to Tony. Because it's almost like he embraces that negative aspect of his character. We see him struggling with it. We see him struggling with when he's at Satriel. Should he run after Tony? Should he tell them that there's another attempt on his life?
Yeah.
But in that moment, it's the moment where he chooses to break down the family norms and what's perceived as acceptable and good behavior that he decides to tell Tony where Phil is, which is a huge overreach.
He's kind of embracing his evil
That's
parts or whatever,
pretty bad.
right?
I mean, he's basically killing somebody.
Yeah. And when he finds out that Phil dies, his reaction is, we're going to win this thing.
Yeah. So all of a sudden he's complicit.
Totally.
He's like, aiding and abetting Tony.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is wild. And I think that that's a really fascinating evolution to the FBI cop character on the show.
But you see, I mean, he's like, what a great character. Again, like I mentioned, he was one of the ones that this YouTube channel used to have a full arc of his. Not a ton of screen time. We don't spend a lot of time with Agent Harris, right? However, we see this de-evolution of this character, of this guy who, is I think like, from the beginning, like trying to do good in the world, right? Like trying to make a difference, like whatever in his time with, dealing with the crime families and whatever, prosecuting them for their crimes, moving into this anti-terrorism unit where, you're trying to protect a country from, something like September 11th, which occurs in the context of this show. And then not having any, like, there's no winning, right? And same with the Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq conflict, right? That there's this, like, this feeling that people are out there doing good, but it's kind of futile, right? Like, there's actually nothing really happening besides more, like, more evil. Like he's talking about going to Newark, and there was this guy who was getting on a plane. He's like, well, maybe we stopped it, or maybe they were just trying to see our reaction, or maybe it was bad information, right? He's not feeling fulfilled in his life either. And so, something like, in some ways, like, you could read it as, he is protecting someone who he cares about.
Right.
And he can actually make a difference there. He can actually...
It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's gray area.
It's really great.
As it should be.
I also love the scene. Sorry, now I'm kind of jumping.
That's okay.
It's tiring to do such a long episode. But I wanted to talk about Janice, and I wanted to talk about the scene where there is this... It's just like a great scene. Maybe I'll talk about it first. Where George has brokered this this meeting. Right. I love when we meet like characters, like you're like, okay, George. Yeah, George is the one brokering this meeting, and Walden is a character. But no, like, so there's this meeting in that like in like a mechanic shop factory, and it's this like they're very cold, right? They're all sitting there in their jackets, and nobody
drinks any water, no ablution.
No, exactly. These water bottles are sitting on the table, and they've like come to this quote unquote like peace agreement, right? But it's this cold, I don't know, there's just something about that scene where like you're not left feeling, even little Carmine walking away, I forget what he says when he walks away, like it didn't have to be this way or something like that, right? Like there was this hope kind of for these, at least like collegial relationships between New Jersey and New York, right? But now I don't know what we're really left with there, or what the future of the New York, with Phil dead now.
Yeah,
right?
Excellent
like
question.
Where that's going to go, where the relationship between those two families is going to be in the future. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But there is that like kind of like that wrapping up of that in some ways in that scene, in this like very industrial, dark, cold place. Yeah.
No, totally. Yeah, it is interesting, and I think
it's just like, again, like when you talk about like a visual genius of this show, like freeze frame any of those shots.
Wow. Yeah. And it's also like more of a classic mob shot. Like it reminds me of when they're in Miami, right? Meeting with those.
Well, it reminds me of the scene from Cleaver where like that we see, like, you know, where he's like, they're in this auto body shop and.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally. And that's interesting, right? Good catch, actually, because this show very rarely jumps into mafia tropes.
Yeah.
So the fact that at the moment of investigating this New York, New Jersey sit down where they figure out the mob war is actually taking place in the same environment as Cleaver takes place, which is this kind of like meta take on the genre, which is a little bit dismissive and
with Danny Baldwin.
Offensive. The fact that they put it there is interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely interesting. I have kind of stray observations.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about Janice a little bit.
Janice, let's talk about Janice.
Yeah, because I think, like, again, like, I think we will do maybe not a season 6. I don't know. We'll have to figure it out. But, you know, like, we do really like to examine characters' arcs throughout seasons. But, like, I mean, obviously, like, I kind of want to think about them at this point as, you know, overarching from the whole show.
Right.
And we do get this closure with Janice a little bit more than we get with other characters in this episode. We got actually a lot of time with Janice in this episode, truly, like more than we've gotten of her in a lot of the show.
Right.
Where we have these couple different scenes with her, right? We have Tony going to her place and she's lying on the patio, right? We're in this house that used to belong to Johnny Sack. Her husband's dead. Her stepson wants to go live with his aunt. She's trying to keep the other stepdaughter there, you know, to be the older sister to this other child that she and Bobby have had.
Yeah.
But she's making these jokes and she's talking about their family, right? Like she's talking about these jokes that only like you have to be in the family to get.
Right. And
that other people don't, like, you know, Bobby took it too seriously, right? Or like only you, Tony, would know that this is a joke. Right. And, you know, and so we get her, you know, really, you know, obviously distraught. Like I don't doubt that Janice cared about Bobby and their life, but I think it is a little bit more like, you know, the life that they were able to have because of Bobby's involvement with Tony's family. But then we get her going to see Junior later on. Also, we get, you know, we kind of get an update on, or in like a very, you know, kind of one-off way about Harpo / Hal, and like her creating this new,
I guess, squashing the theory
family.
that Harpo was the one killed in Montreal, but maybe she wouldn't know.
Maybe she wouldn't know, and yeah, who knows when he changed his name to Hal.
It's possible.
But you know, like Janice is this other person who didn't escape. You know, I mean, Janice really did escape for a while. Like she was away.
Her life was weird and sucked.
Yeah, but she
was dating like a pizza delivery boy at one point.
She was but that's even after. That's when she leaves again, right? Like we enter this show with Janice having been away for a long time at the very beginning of this show.
But I don't think her life was that cool.
No, she was like, she changed her name to
Pravanti or whatever.
Yeah.
Something stupid.
Maybe
it's a nice name. It's a nice name.
Parvati.
I just don't like Janice.
Yeah.
Parvati. Good job.
But we're left with her here. Like what's Janice's future? You know, will she just find another mob husband, right? Which she does joke about, right? Like she has to watch her weight because she needs to get another husband. You know, she, like, Tony, like, does say, like, you know, create this new nuclear family, which she'll never have that. Like Harpo's never going to come and live with her.
Right.
You know, and then we have her going to see Junior, and you know, only really like I think her only purpose really is to get the money that Junior might have.
Well, we actually have Junior.
Stashed.
One of the moments where we actually see some lucidity with him is where he's saying Janice when he looks at the picture and he says she left the stove on purpose.
Yeah.
Right. So he actually does recognize Janice as this kind of snake in the grass, and actually, as kind of demented as he's become.
Can recognize that.
That's the one thing that he does recognize and actually leaves us with. So it really does suggest that Janice is after the money, and that is what Pat suggests as well, who clearly has a closer connection to Junior than pretty much anyone else. Yeah. Also, we're left with Janice in this house where when Tony visits, he reminisces about when Johnny Sack bought it not that long ago. How all you could see was farmland. And now it's this kind of in this suburban environment. So again, Janice now has to deal with, like everybody else, existing in a world that is more and more difficult to operate in as a member of the mafia because there's no room for it. It's essentially been pushed out.
Yep.
And whereas Johnny Sack was kind of king of that domain, that house has actually kind of been enveloped by the normalness and the normalcy of American suburban life by that point.
Yeah. He
brings her Ferraras. He brings her...
Which is a great choice.
I have to say, great job, Tony. He's not all bad. Yin and yang. There's some white and the black.
Some yummy cannolis.
Ferraras, it's a little expensive, but it might be the best, my favorite cannoli, standard cannoli in New York. For chocolate-covered cannolis,
Did he go into New York
I like
to
a
get them, though?
Gideos. Well, I guess he was talking to New York. He's probably talking to Butchie. He went to Ferraras. It's a great choice. Yeah. It's a great cannoli.
Yeah. I just wanted to come back just before maybe we do some stray thoughts. And I think, again, coming back to this central philosophy of The Sopranos, you know, these questions of what is there? Is it all a big, or is it all a big nothing, right? Who are you and where are you going? And we do have this, I mean, the last time we see Paulie, right? We have this conversation between him and Tony. And they're talking about, again, these superstitions that they have. And Tony says to Paulie, I'm not saying there's nothing out there.
But to not live your life.
Yeah. But to not live your life. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I thought I'd be reading along with you because I wrote it out.
I paraphrase typically.
I think I'm not saying...
But to not live your life... Go ahead.
Actually, that next word I wrote very poorly, so you got it. I see. WTF. What the fuck you gonna do? Yeah. I was like, what are you gonna do?
And I think, again, like I said, like that kind of comes back to that central message too, is like, you know, that you have to hold on to something. You have to keep believing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But it's also a testament to Tony's narcissism. I'm not saying that there's nothing out there, but to not live your life, what the fuck are you going to do? It's dismissive of the impact that you have on others. Yep. And ultimately, when Paulie does accept, the cat comes over, which is interesting too. So we have these maybe different possible interpretations. It's a moment where lines could diverge. Yeah. And we could interpret it in different ways. Maybe it is cursed. Maybe Paulie's correct. Maybe Paulie is going to die. Like everybody before him. Yep. If you have a kind of supernatural reading of those elements, then the evidence is kind of laid out that Paulie probably would die. Definitely.
I mean, also he's the oldest now of all these guys. Well, Junior. I mean, you know, like, again, kind of going back to this, like, this curse and this genealogy, right? That we look at these different generations and where they're left in the end of this. Yeah. Like Junior's the last of that generation. Paulie was part of that too, right? Like Paulie was he was younger than Johnny Boy and Junior. Right. But not by a lot. Like he is part of this kind of like older generation. It's just that he kind of like never, you know, grew up, quote unquote. Yeah. And, you know, I don't know, he like stayed single and stayed young and was this kind of uncle character. And like he probably, you know, at least if we think about, you know, characters living to the end of their lives, like he's probably is the next one to die. Probably. Talks about his prostate thing, you know? He had the prostate. Right. But you know, and so yeah, but he's like, Polly's such a, I always wish we like knew Polly better, because
Right.
he is such like a weird duck. Like, how does he see his life and his purpose in life?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially now with his mom dead and, well, / his aunt, you know, but anyways.
Right. But yeah, these ultimate places where people find themselves are really interesting. I think there is maybe multiple readings on Polly, but on other people it seems more clear cut to me. Like the kids we've talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Carmela in real estate, there is this kind of like inevitability to her also engaging in this kind of toxic behavior that I think is really interesting, because for most of the show she's more complicit than involved in criminal operations.
She's really involved.
And now she's rather involved.
Yeah.
It's not as obvious as what Tony does, but the fact that she would overlook something toxic that she wouldn't want to breathe in the house and would sell it to somebody else, or basically get people to lean on inspectors and have shoddy workmanship, is very concerning.
Yeah.
And she has agency in that, and ultimately she has chosen who she wants to become, and she's chosen to become a pretty bad person.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. She's not just turning a blind eye anymore.
No.
She's involved.
Yep.
AJ, we've talked a lot about, but there is this aspect too of him becoming his father. And even like after the car blows up and Tony's talking to him and AJ uses vocabulary and language like, isn't that what you have insurance for? It's that kind of rationalization to heinous acts that just kind of mimics what Tony has been doing for the whole show and has the way that he's lived his life, and ultimately leads me to believe that there isn't maybe that much hope for him and that he will be following the same cycle. And if we were to revisit the next generation, we would follow AJ and maybe find some of the same issues.
Yeah.
Albeit in a different place. I don't think I see AJ.
Do you think
joining
he'll
the
ever
mob.
open his club?
I don't know. Depends on your interpretation of the ending. What do you think happens to Tony? I can give you an answer depending on what happens to Tony.
I don't know.
Probably not. Honestly, I think most endings that we could possibly interpret lead to the financial downfall of the Soprano family. Mm-hmm. Things are probably going to be pretty bleak for all of them after that point. I mean, whether he dies, whether he goes to jail.
Yep. Like we saw with Johnny Sack.
It's pretty unlikely that he just beats everything and is fine
Yeah.
and business continues as usual.
Yeah.
Like, best case scenario, he's not dead. Okay. Carlo Gervasi, one of his main
Guys.
guys, the capo, is testifying against him. He would have enough information. Capo.
Yeah, you did it.
I did it.
Yeah.
I did it finally. The last episode. I didn't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
Capo.
Capo.
We were told to say it correctly. I didn't say it correctly before. Chances are he's going to be arrested. Not only is it 85 to 90% that he's indicted, I think the odds are pretty similar that he's arrested.
Yeah.
Even kind of the rationalization of his lawyer, like, trials are made to win. Okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of a platitude. Like, I don't think Tony would beat that.
Yeah. It's not like we haven't envisioned this day.
Yeah. And yet it's possible. They could kill Carlo. That's what the mob does, I guess. We also have these alternate kind of stories that are presented to us very quickly, like Hunter Scangarello coming back and how she's in her second
She's
year
in med school.
She's in med school and how Carmela's upset about that. But how she actually did change is interesting. How she was kicked out of school for drunk driving and then ended up going to Purchase and getting her act together. She actually kind of embodies somebody who
It's like
did kind of...
redeemable.
Yeah, that redemption does exist, and how actually that frustrates, annoys, and angers Carmela.
Yep.
Because she hasn't done that is really interesting.
Yep. And Meadow won't.
And Meadow probably won't.
Yeah.
According to Val's interpretation. Val's ultimate interpretation.
Of Meadow.
There's more to me about that idea of the good old days. Mm-hmm. Like, those were the days. Even like the statement of they basically find Phil because there's only a couple stations that have payphones anymore.
Right.
This idea of like payphones
Yeah,
essentially
that's a good one.
becoming extinct.
Yeah.
And how they actually are able to use that to
Yeah.
their advantage because the mafia still relies on these old devices.
Yeah.
Is really...
I like that.
Is really interesting.
Well, we have a thing with phones in this show too.
It's
though.
ultimately their own downfall, right?
Yeah.
Their unwillingness to adapt.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and phones are something that, I mean, think about Pine Barrens. There's so much about
Yeah.
communication and phones and phone calls and reception.
I think Polly's phone ringer is Celia by Simon and
Yeah,
Garfunkel.
it is.
It's a good song.
Those are our new comments. Like, it's a good song.
Yeah.
I like it. Tony bringing up Livia and AJ's therapy and ultimately just beginning a new cycle of manipulating a new
Therapist.
is interesting. Carmela not having any of it.
No,
but
Carmela
Tony
is like...
being in complete control.
Yeah.
And ultimately being able to pull the strings of somebody very easily. If anything, he's probably just trained through his experience with Melfi in order to bring attention to himself, but also displaying him as this complete narcissist, not really being concerned about his son. It's not about AJ, and he turns it into being about himself. Successfully.
Yeah.
Silvio, we're left with
Yeah.
in a coma. The last thing we hear about his condition is that he probably won't wake up from it.
Yeah.
Ultimately, regardless of your reading of the ending, the Soprano family is kind of decimated.
Yeah.
Bobby's gone. Silvio is gone for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
Tony is
Carlo
probably
is gone.
Carlo is gone. What are we really left with? And if we interpret it as Tony going to jail or being killed,
Who's in charge?
who's in charge, and would it even exist?
Yeah.
It's actually more likely that the New York family could get involved and kind of take over the operations.
Yeah.
And that's the end. So maybe we've seen the end of The Sopranos.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the end of the dynasty.
Yeah.
And maybe
Okay.
that's a possible reading.
Yeah, like, you know, again, like, and I think it is kind of with this, like, Patsy versus Polly, because those are kind of like the top guys now,
Right.
right? And like, are either of them really capable of running a family?
Right.
No, you know.
No. Patsy may be more than Polly, but who knows?
Kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably not.
Yeah.
Going back to the last scene, I just want to kind of focus on these kind of two things that we were talking about. Just kind of the representation of America that exists with the characters that are there, the Boy Scouts, the
USA
the
hat.
couple, USA hat. It's kind of, yeah, like Joe Everyman.
These black guys.
These African Americans that are there, this kind of melting pot that exists at this kind of soda fountain place, and the focus on all of them and their stories that are happening around the Sopranos, and how the Sopranos are essentially an American story and part of the kind of tapestry that is America. And this mural, I just think, is so pivotal. And I think that
With
actually,
the
you know,
white, like those
I don't
white
think we talked
building,
about
this
that
White
yet.
House.
My
No,
God,
I
that's
know.
like one of the more important things. But we have an image of the Tiger, the 1973 state champions, and we have this white school, which I guess I can imagine is the Bloomfield School where the football team is from. But the white school is extremely reminiscent of these white houses that have been associated with the afterlife. We've seen it with Livia walking down the stairs in Tony's dream. We've seen it with the house that Steve Buscemi, I just call him Steve Buscemi now, not Tony, that Steve Buscemi is killed
Tony
at.
B. Yeah.
Doesn't everybody remember that actor Steve Buscemi before he got shot by Tony Soprano at a house? There are multiple examples throughout the series of a house that looks like that. Actually, I think Uncle Pat's farmhouse, this place kind of from Tony's childhood that is related to death. And is where Steve Buscemi is kind of inviting Tony in and he doesn't want to go to. Well, ultimately, we're left with that place in the last scene.
Yeah.
So between Tony confronting basically all the symbols that we've had of the afterlife and death, going all the way back to the first episode of water, trees, now the sun, this white house, and confronting maybe the central aspect of his subconscious, this inability to be a football player, to follow a different trajectory. Going back to the pilot, talking about an overdub, talking about how it was a terrible blow to his self-esteem when his Uncle Junior said that he would never be a varsity athlete. There's this central aspect of his psychology that we're confronted with at the end of the show. And as the show ends, and as it dies, or Tony dies, or we're left to ruminate what actually happens, there is this kind of framing of the end, and also Tony's key focus in his psychology, what's important to him. And however you read it, it could suggest that he dies. It could be a symbol of the afterlife, of death. But it also just suggests finality. And it also suggests these key psychological aspects of Tony as a character.
Well, it's kind of this. It's like a house for your psyche in some ways too. Like it's this
Right.
place where it's like
Interesting.
stored, right? Because we think about the basement of the school, right? If that is the school in the mural, which
Right.
I think it is.
Interesting. Oh, I didn't even
Right?
get that.
Like
Wow.
that. This
Amazing.
is this place that is like the deepest part of Tony's psyche, right?
Right.
That there's this like, and again, these white houses and these places where these dark parts of your, or whatever, not even just dark parts, like where all these parts of your person and who you are kind of live and are stored.
Right.
And I think that's, again, with the focus on dreams in this show and of, therapy and psychology, that it is this image of like the impact that has on people, right? Like
Right.
that your psyche, it's this big house that's always just like coming around with you, where all these things live. And it's hard to access.
Yeah.
But important to do so.
Absolutely.
I don't think we leave this show with like I don't think that Chase's idea of the subconscious and of dreams is that they aren't important.
Yeah.
And you're the way you're raised and
No.
and even your genes, right? Your nature and your nurture and all these, like I for me, like I think he's puts a lot of importance on those
Right.
those elements.
And ultimately, Tony maybe doesn't fully access them and reflect on them and come to an understanding of them, but we can. And as an audience, we're given these same questions, and it's up to us to work through them. Mm-hmm. And that's...
Well, and in our own lives too, right? Like
Right.
to like look at like who are you and where are you going and what are the things that you were given by your family and what are the things that what are the orbits that you struggle to
Right. Break
escape
out of.
from, and to really that there isn't like there's not going to be a black and white answer to those things, but it's like what you do with it,
Absolutely.
and that all these possibilities can all exist at the same time.
Yeah.
Like Tony can be Kevin Finnerty at the same time as being Tony, and
Right.
he and in some ways he is this everyman patio salesman too.
Mm-hmm.
Patio furniture salesman. Or he's this guy who like sometimes in the good moments cares about his family
Right.
and is torn about the decisions that he makes, and then at other moments he's not.
Right. Absolutely.
They can all exist at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think like all these endings that we talk about, they can all exist at the same time too. It's like part of the fun, part of part of life, right? Like that they're all of these potentials all exist in the same moment,
Yeah.
and it's about what you believe in.
Quantum Sopranos.
Quantum Sopranos.
Wow. I think that's it.
That's it. No, great.
For me, at least. I don't know. I want to know your
wonder if I have
ideas.
any like weird, like just like a weird,
I would love
like,
to know your stray observations.
Yeah, I think I kind of covered them, to be honest. I didn't really like get a bunch of them, but it'd be funny if we left on being like, like, I don't know, something about Walden or something. I would
The
kinda-
key to this show is Walden.
Yeah. Oh, the Magic Bullet commercial that's playing in the...
Yeah, let's leave it with some levity. Yeah, it's a very serious show. Magic Bullet's a great appliance.
Yeah. What else? No, you know what? I didn't write that many things like that down. I love, this show always gives us, it's a gift, really, but it gives us, these moments to laugh at, and it gives us these really deep psychological, philosophical questions, and it gives us complexity and multiple possibilities. So
Yeah.
I think it's...
And I think it is like the great American television show and a turning point in television as a genre too, because it is everything. It is so funny.
Yeah.
It is so profound. It's so
Yeah.
philosophical. There are so many layers
It's
to
so
it.
artful.
We can view it strictly for its narrative, and it's so compelling, and yet there are all these amazing lessons to be learned from it underneath the surface. All these complexities that exist on different levels.
I mean, all of the mastery of film that exists with it,
referencing
and
other
acting.
films,
Yeah.
tying together threads throughout the actual show, looking at the breakdown of form, both on a
Like,
season level,
what is television? Yeah.
and really, asking questions of what is television and what can it be,
Yeah.
and turning it more into a kind of a discipline like
High
film.
art, yeah.
Yeah, and really turning it into art.
Yeah.
So
I guess that's it.
It's been a long time working on this podcast. I'm looking forward to having a little bit more disposable time when we have disposable time, not frantically recording Sopranos episodes to make sure that they get out there for deadlines.
Yeah.
But it's been very fun.
No,
We've really enjoyed it.
This was a project that was for us.
Yeah.
It didn't really start out as anything that was for an audience necessarily.
Right. We just love talking about it and thinking about it.
Yeah.
And this was a way for us to kind of get our ideas together and to also connect with
challenge,
people who are interested.
Yeah, to challenge ourselves to really think deeply, because I think like it's easy to watch things, to consume art, and to just consume it and that's it and not do anything with it. And I think it's challenged us to think deeply about issues that are really important that this show brings up, and to, I don't know, like put it out there instead of just, watching it and being like, that was a great episode of TV.
Right.
Which we never did to begin with. But,
right.
We
didn't talk about like how cool it was when Philly Tardo got whacked.
Gosh.
It wasn't that cool.
But yeah, it's been fun.
It's been very fun. Thank you for listening. We do really appreciate it. If you made it this far.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we really appreciate, again, like we love to nerd out about The Sopranos and talk about these things with each other, but also with other people. And so like, I think it's been a real gift to like also find other people who want to talk about this crazy thing with us.
Yeah. And also, I mean, on this viewing, we've also tried to kind of limit our reading before talking about this show.
We haven't read it before this.
Yeah. But also like kudos to some of the people who have been out there writing about the show and analyzing it, and at least for myself, really opened it up. Like, really changed my understanding of the show, especially the website Sopranos Autopsy.
Can't wait for him to do his last episode.
I can't wait to read it. He's an amazing...
I haven't read.
He's an amazing thinker, an amazing writer, and we're just really grateful for people like that who have been contributing to
the body of work on
The Sopranos and thinking about it and helping people like us think about it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so hopefully that's our contribution to throw something out there.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we talk about this, like neither of us have a film background at all.
Right.
Zero.
Yeah.
We're just, and so like, sometimes like I wish I had better, insight into some of those elements as well. But I think we've also like, this has forced us to learn a lot.
Absolutely.
At least for myself about this too. And I think, I don't know, we'll see what we try to do next, but maybe just more learning.
More learning. We love to learn. We're curious and we like stuff like this.
We like The Sopranos. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's all.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you've been listening the whole time, really, thank you so much for listening and being with us on this journey. And we'll be back with, at some point, a discussion over 6 Feet.
Yes.